At Empower Us, we're delivering compelling conversations on nonprofit tech and fundraising. We're bringing together nonprofit leaders in the field and tech providers that are powering missions around the world. This week, we're discussing data and payment security, a critical component of fundraising tech. With rapid digital transformation underway for nonprofits, security is more important than ever. And it's not just about protecting against risks, it's about donor centricity. Donors want and expect their data to be secure, and it's fundamental to the donor relationship. We're joined by Woodrow Rosenblum and Andrew Moussaoui, who walk us through how to ensure appropriate security measures at your organization through partnership with your vendors, incentivizing your teams, and rethinking the bounds of donor relationships.
My name is Woodrow Rosenbaum. I'm the Chief Data Officer at Giving Tuesday.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Moussaoui. I'm the president of IATS Payments.
Great. So I'll just jump in here to get things started, and I'd love to get both of your perspectives on data, payment security. It's a really broad topic area and something that has been front of mind this year, and in general, as more and more nonprofits are moving more things to be digital and staying on top of their data. From your perspective and your experience, like, where have you seen things gone wrong? What do people need to be focused on? What are the common pitfalls? And Woodrow, if you want to kick it off.
Sure. I mean, our situation is a little bit different, probably, than a lot of organizations and platforms, because we're not a transaction platform, but we do get data from lots of different sources, which of course means that we have to have pretty robust data security in place, and we work with hundreds of platforms in various capacities through this data and insights collaborative. I think there have been some obvious situations recently that of data security breaches, both in the sector but I mean, we hear about them all the time. In terms of what is typical in the pitfalls, I think a lot of it comes down to complacency, right? We get into routines, and sometimes those routines are just not helping us to get out of a rut, right? We're just going through the paces instead of actually reviewing what's going on. In the nonprofit sector, I think there's an added interesting layer, because we are seeing lots of organizations move to digital this year in probably unprecedented numbers. And so they're moving on to platforms that have potential larger exposure in that they're in the cloud. They may be using vendors that are now targets because of their volume. But interestingly, the flip side of that is, what were they doing before that? There's a lot of stuff on laptops and donor information in spreadsheets with little encryption or security, shared passwords. So I think in the sector, we have to kind of look at it. There's two levels of security issue. One is, how are these large platforms that handle enormous amounts of personal identifiable information handling that and ensuring that it's safe, because it's opaque to the users largely, or to the clients largely. And then the other side is there's all this legacy systems and process in the nonprofit sector that are just inherently insecure. And I think both of these things are issues, and we're going to see them become issues increasingly.
Andrew, anything you'd add there?
Yeah, it's a great perspective, Woodrow. And I think that what's interesting is, IATS, we're a payment provider, and we've been doing this in the nonprofit space for over 20 years, and we've seen an awful lot of change in that 20 years. And so, for those that are listening that don't know, we're an integrated payment provider. So we actually provide the back end, full service transaction processing for over 100 of the technology partners, many of which we all know in the sector, some of the largest players in the nonprofit sector, and to as a result, over 15,000 nonprofit organizations. And I think that what we've seen is really, I think you're quite right. I think there's two elements. The risks are coming predominantly from, there's internal and then there's external risks. And the external ones are the ones that are publicized the most. These are the ones that are, the fraudulent attempts. There's the card velocity testing. There's the breaches and the hacks and all of those things that are very visible, very prevalent and very harmful and dangerous. Obviously, financially, but also from just a sheer reputational damage perspective for organizations that get that suffer those kind of breaches. And I think there are the other types, which is the internal risks, which is, as you say, it's that, you say complacency, and I agree with you, but it's also the speed with which things are changing, and the kind of the lack of readily available or just very complex information about that. So if you think of payment security or security in general as being, systems, processes, and products, then there's a whole bunch of different ways that you need to mitigate those risks through audits, through proper security reviews, through legislative compliance of things like PCI, through even just doing things like criminal background checks on employees. All of these things are overwhelming to a sector and an industry that is already overworked and under-resourced, and that is struggling with trying to find out a way to how to supplement and replace declining income in certain parts of their organization. So I think that there's twofold. There's the rapid advancement and adoption of technology. I remember back in, when I first started this in 2002, everyone was putting up a donate now page, and it was like you just put up a donate now page, and then the millions of dollars will flow through. And then everyone realized it was a little more complex than that, and it's evolved and it's become more sophisticated. But yet, this year there's been almost a second or third wave where we've seen our own products. We've seen the adoption of those products increase quadruple what they were pre-COVID, as people are now realizing that they have to make the move away from those analog offline to the online piece. So I think it's an incredibly complex topic. I think the risks are complex. I think the nonprofit sector, sadly, is a target for many of those risks. And I think it's an important discussion that we, as providers and knowledge leaders and informers in the space, we have a responsibility to share and talk about, because sometimes it's the second or third thing on an organization's to-do list. The first being just get the product out there. The third thing being, well, what's the risk of my organization if that happens?
Yeah, and I think that the placement on the to-do list or priorities is a really good point, and something that might be worth digging into a bit. If you were advising an organization, and maybe you can provide some context of different sizes where there's different levels of relevance, but not wanting to be fear-mongering and say everyone should be living in fear about cyber attacks, but just how high of a priority does that need to be in your perspective, and how can you help the organization appreciate that priority and do more to protect themselves?
It's a really tough question, in part because all security, not just digital security, has a really poor ROI when it's done well, right? We make these investments hoping that it's wasted money, and then you're trying to prioritize, and how much is enough attention to spend, and how much is enough resource to commit. It's really hard to know that. I think this is where nonprofit sector, in terms of the actual organizations, that this is not something they're going to be able to figure out on their own. They need standards, and they need it to be easy to understand, and they need to then be able to implement those standards. And it's a bit too much of a dog's breakfast right now from the perspective of the user. I think at the platform and the payment processor level, it gets better, and that's where the support needs to be for the actual sector players, because they'll never be able to figure that out. You can just keep investing forever. You can always make your system a little bit more secure. So what is the right amount is just difficult without those standards in place.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's actually, it's about challenging and asking your support structure, whoever you may be. And I'm with you, Mitch. I don't think that there is I think everyone understands, if asked, how important data security is, and especially when it comes to cards. I think everyone understands. I think if you ask somebody 10 to 15 years ago what PCI was, you may well get a small percentage of responses of people that really truly understood it. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think people have a much greater understanding about the risks and the necessity for having data security when it comes to payments. I think it's about the separation between responsibilities. I think is getting smaller. I think initially, then it's almost as though everything could be pushed on the provider, and whether that's a technology provider, a service provider, everything can be sort of pushed on them and say, well, listen, that's not my thing. I've got to. It's in the cloud. It's there. It's, you know, I don't have to worry about that. But I think what's happening now is that separation between what is my responsibility as an organization, as a merchant, as a whatever that entity is, that everything becomes my responsibility. It's my responsibility because I have to make sure I choose the right provider. I have to make sure that my providers' certifications and audits are up to date, that they have got all of those best practices in place. It's my responsibility as that entity, as the deciding entity, to make sure that I'm challenging and questioning those providers and partners that we are bringing in our organization, because ultimately it is my donors at stake, it is my credibility at stake, and it is the credibility of my organization that is at stake. And I think that is changing, and I think more and more organizations of many different sizes are starting to realize that, and it is not a great investment to be able to challenge and ask those questions. And I think that's positive progress. There's no question about it. And I think we're going to continue to see it as this move online continues, which is increasing all of those risks tenfold.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point that I think for a lot of organizations I've worked with, it seems that they don't really necessarily know the right questions to ask. Like, how do I vet that provider? Who would have thought Blackbaud was a risk? You know, like those kinds of things are not top of mind for them. So especially as the provider and Woodruff, someone who's evaluated and works with a lot of these platforms, what are the right questions to ask? What are the things that they should be delivering for you in terms of documentation and how you really make sure they have the right safeguards in place?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's actually stuff for us to answer from our perspective, because I think at the end of the day, most of the major platforms just going to have pretty good answers to that stuff, and it's hard to know what's going on because it is fairly opaque to the user. Andrew could probably answer better kind of what specific questions to ask those providers. But if I was running a nonprofit and choosing a platform to support us, I think what I would want to know is, what do I need to do on my end? Because I need to know what is the right investment, what are the right protocols and processes to have in place. Yeah, I'm going to need to know kind of that you've got your end buttoned down, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like taking your car to a mechanic, right? They know more about this than you do. They're going to tell you it's all good, and you're going to have kind of, educate yourself and look into it and make a comparison. But most of these platforms are going to make a pretty good case that they have their security is compliant, that they're using the right systems, and certainly no system is ever going to be perfect. But on my end, in terms of running an organization, I want advice on how do I make sure I'm not the weak link? What do I need to do to make sure that our processes are in place? Because you really should be thinking about it as a partnership, as opposed to, like Andrew said, well, now I've delegated that responsibility to somebody I trust, and it's all in the cloud, and now it's not my problem, because Andrew's right. You're the one that's going to realize those risks. And I think that's where there probably isn't a lot of understanding, but it's also probably where you've got more control, and it's actually probably the simpler part of this for those organizations in laying out procedures somebody else helps them to identify.
Your comment there was just spot on, which is the question is about, because you can ask and the answer, do you do the audit? Are you PCI? Are you doing it? And the answer is, yeah, just tick the box. Yeah, yes, that's fine. Just tick the box. I think the question is more around, and I think this is where you were going, which is how does my implementation of your system, your process, whatever that might be, what elements of scope does that put me in as an organization? Where are the risk elements that I have, and what do I have to do on my end to mitigate those things? Because there are payoffs in everything. There is as an example, you want to obviously streamline I'm going to give you a very simple example. any organization is going to want to do whatever they possibly can to make the donor's journey as simple as possible. There is a indirect payoff with this, with security, because the security is, and again, an extreme example, I'm going to have address verification and capture, and I'm going to have it switched on to such a degree that if you don't use a capital letter at the very beginning of your address, then I'm going to reject the transaction. Well, an extreme example. Well, then the payoff to that is, well, I'm not interested in doing that. I'll just switch everything off, but I don't really want to take the risk with it. Well, that's mutually exclusive. So the question then is, right, well, what scope, the implementation of this system, how does that increase risk or open me up for risk? And what is my scope requirements for that? And you'll forgive me when I use the word scope, but it's the vernacular of PCI, which is, my vendors and my partners can be doing everything and be secure, and they can be audited, and they can be the highest level of PCI. But if there's something that I'm doing on my end in the way that I'm implementing it puts me out of scope or in scope with PCI, it means that physically I now have to go through a much higher level of audit than perhaps I would have if I'd have implemented another solution. So asking the questions about how my organization fits into the overall scope and whether or not that organization has downstream audit checks with their providers, because whether you're a CRM provider or an online peer-to-peer fundraising provider, almost always they're using a payment provider like us, like IATS. Well, the question is, well, what are the auditory requirements that they've gone through to make sure that we are in scope and our providers as IATS are in scope as well? And that's a downstream. And just by having those questions, I think people are going to be very quickly either comforted or they're not, and they're going to ask more questions that their providers have actually thought through these things.
Yeah, and so maybe, Woodrow, to your point, it's beyond just checking a box. Like, you want to know a bit more context, not just are you PCI compliant, but how do you go about these things? How do you manage your vendors on the other side? And it sounds like there's a lot of value too in the resources they can provide to you as an organization in forming your own practices and how you use that tool. I mean, Andrew, do you, from the IATS perspective, do you have like guidelines you present to every user, when you're going direct to an organization?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we have not only guidelines, but also best practices. We will go out there and say, if you are, so for example, capture is a very, very well-known way of reducing the instances of velocity testing. And that, for those of you that are unaware, this is one of the biggest risks that we see in our sector from an external reach perspective, which is people just getting thousands of credit cards that they want to check, and they go to a charitable website and they just check the cards. They make a dollar donation, and for payment providers that are not familiar with the nonprofit space, that if they're used to retail type fraud in a retail environment, then they just don't aware that that's a massive risk in the nonprofit space. And so, we know that very, very well. We block millions and millions of those transactions on an annual basis, especially around, between Giving Tuesday and the year-end giving. It's when we see that increase sort of go towards the end of the year. And so we're very firm about our implementation of things like capturing within our own pages, because frankly we see them as a necessity with all the risks out there. Making sure that organizations understand that PCI compliance isn't as complicated as people would have you believe. There are a set of simple tools that you can get that allow you to go through the process to give you peace of mind that your data is secured. And in a very non-threatening, kind of alarmist way, sort of provide that education and services. So yeah, we do as much as we are able to, and sort of sharing those best practices as well. But there is noise, and nonprofit organizations, they have a lot of noise to deal with, and they have a lot of other things that they have to deal with, and it's just another thing that is an additional noise, and sometimes investment, and sometimes focus of time. That is just yet another thing that they need to do. So it's understandable why perhaps it doesn't make its way to the top of the list.
I was just thinking about, we think a lot about incentivizing behavior, right? Where, like, if you're working on providing something that will be helpful, How do you get people to engage with it, even if it's not at the top of their list? I was curious, do you ever give any thought of how you incentivize better security practices from your users? Like if you go through these steps, there's some discount or advantage or something that we offer? Because I imagine it, obviously if there's user error, it looks poorly on the provider side too. So you actually do have real ROI from that adoption, and best practices from the user's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, as a payment provider, not really as a product. We integrate with the best-in-class technology providers that are out there, and so really the value that we bring is that integrated payments and security and service to the nonprofit sector. That's where we fit. So we're not really deploying products ourselves that what you're sort of referencing there. I think our value, and I think that what we can do, and sadly, the greatest incentive is when things happen to others and they see the consequences of things happening to others. When organizations have to physically email their donors out and let them know that they have suffered and they've been victims of whatever that might be, it is an incentive for people to understand how seriously it does impact an organization's credibility, because it creates additional noise in the relationship between the donor. I'm sure they would not like to waste that space of connecting with the donor to tell them that something was wrong. They want to use that opportunity to tell them about the fantastic work that they're doing, whatever their mission might be. And so I think, and that is just to say that happens a lot. That happens if you go back to the last 10, 15, 20 years. In the for-profit world, there are plenty of opportunities to share that. And I think we have to continue doing that. I think that the payment industry in general is becoming better at incentivizing generally. So if you think about the move to EMV certification and things like chip and pin, certainly internationally, in Europe and in Canada, then there is certainly this evolution of security technology that allows for additional layers of protection that protect not only the donor but also the merchants and the customers. That is being rolled out. And I think the payment industry is doing a good job there. I think we need greater adoption for it, especially in the US. If you think about the implementation of something like EMV and chip and pin, it's a lot slower in the US than it is internationally. So I think there's more that we can do as payment providers there. And I think that is where the incentive comes. I think the incentive comes from just education and also the advances of technology that allows for greater security around the online transaction.
I really agree with that. I think that the biggest opportunity to educate is right after there's been a publicized breach. That's when you're going to get people to say, yep, I'll spend a few hours looking at this because they care about it. And Andrew touched on a couple of things that are important. One is new industry level approaches that are always improving. There's some really interesting stuff in the payments space, looking at transaction behavior across lots of different touch points in order to programmatically use machine learning to predict fraudulent behavior. I think that it's fairly fraught, that approach, but it has some really interesting potential applications. But then the other thing Andrew pointed out, which is really worth understanding, is that those industry-wide advancements and standards are critically important. The other side of it is working with a partner who actually understands your business, which is something that nonprofits can evaluate, because it is different. Everybody's, the nonprofit space, and even within the nonprofit space, there are differences. And if you're working with partners who understand your marketplace, they're going to be better at protecting you.
Yeah, that is, it's interesting because I think that in any sector, every sector will say our sector's different. Yeah. But, I've worked in multiple different, as you both have. I mean, you've worked in other sectors, you've worked in other industries, as have I. But the nonprofit sector is different. It's very different in the way that, even if you think about the consideration around an online page in its most simplest form is not transacting. There's no compensation. There's no shipment of product. There's no me not sending the widget out if the payment doesn't complete and I don't get the money in my bank account. There's, so that in of itself, that creates a different environment with which we have to be careful from a transaction perspective. The very nature of the sheer volume of transactions and the average transaction size and things like that, it does make a difference. And I think by working with organizations that truly understand that truly understand what the risks are for that particular sector, if at the very base level, the conversation is not going to be about them, the customer trying to educate the provider about why they're different. At least you can, at the very best, you can skip that bit and you can just get to the actual nuts and bolts of what you're trying to achieve. So, and I think what's interesting is that in my time in the sector, since with a brief sort of from between 2012 and 2015, sort of a brief respite, sort of leaving the sector, but so gladly to be back, I will say that it has fundamentally changed. I think if you look at the number of providers that come into that exist in the nonprofit sector now compared to what they were back in the in 2002, 2003, almost very few of them exist in the form that they existed then. They've been acquired or they've moved on. I think that there's more choice there, definitely, which is wonderful. I think it's a richer opportunity for charities to be able to have more organizations to compare and contrast with. But it is but having that, I think, is a necessity, because it is a very different sector and customers do have very different needs than in other markets.
And one thing that Andrew talked about a bit on the incentive side, I feel like it's worth touching on internally how you incentivize kind of that behavior, Woodrow, as someone that manages a large team. How do you think about incentivizing better security behavior and making sure people are not getting complacent? How do you think about that for your organization?
For me, the risk in my team is when it's hard for them to get their job done, right? And that they have to find a workaround to something. They share a login, or they download some data assets that are proprietary, or they leave something logged in, or those are the sorts of things. So really understanding that it's not about, it's less about dictating specific stringent standards and more about understanding really well everybody's workflow to ensure that the security is not an obstacle to them getting their job done well.
So we live in the extreme of that as a payment provider. And so we have obviously the highest levels of PCI scope and requirements and audit. We have the highest levels of audits. I will say that either we've just completed an audit or we're about to start an audit. That is what we do. That's the necessity of the job, and it filters down to my team, and it filters down to everyone, whether no matter which. And my team spans different cities and different countries between Canada and the US, and we live it in a very real way, because we are constantly having to do tests and checks, and we have an online system where we have to validate, almost like taking a driving test every single quarter. We have to go back and validate that, and I'm constantly reminding my team of why we do that, because sometimes there's a frustration. We can't go into certain file sharing places that others just naturally would use, and what I share with my team is what I'll say now, which is that is for our customers. That is for our nonprofits. Our incentive is to ensure that our environment remains secure and remains at the highest levels of security, so that our customers can have peace of mind and their donors can have peace of mind. And the only way to do it is to connect those two things, because otherwise it's just annoying. It's just another survey that you have to do, or it's another pass key that you have to use to get into an office, or it's another. Unless you connect those two things and bring it to the real world as to why it's so important, it becomes all stick and no carrot. And I find that actually the stick thing is not actually, that doesn't stick, if you excuse the pun. It's actually the carrot and making people understand why we do the things that we do and the very real world benefit of those things. That actually is a little more helpful because it makes people feel as though actually it's worthwhile. There's a reason for it, and they're pleased to do it.
It's the same with us. When we think about it in terms of, we care about a lot of the work we're doing. We're excited and motivated by it. And if we don't have this part done, then if we're not taking care of the security side, then everything else might just be for nothing. And we don't want it to be for nothing. So that's a very strong incentive to make a clear connection between that security. And again, about it not being just routine, but actually thinking about the implications of it, why it's connected to your work, that it's not a separate process, that's how you make sure that it's part of culture.
Woodrow, I have a question, because it's interesting that there are some very tactical things that we obviously see with the sheer volume increase that we've seen online.
Yeah.
And the shift from offline to online during COVID, especially in the event space, has created some very tactical things in terms of, in additional security, additional constraints or thoughts about things like that. My question is, have you seen a shift in how organizations at the top are actually are viewing that shift and the structural changes from a security standpoint that they need to be making? Or do you feel at the moment people are just kind of just struggling with the tactical changes that need to happen to accommodate that shift?
Yeah, I think with the exception of a little bit of, oh my God, something just happened, are we okay? Someone call our provider and ask them if we're okay. I think it's mostly the latter. It's mostly a scramble to adopt new business practices. And that's been the primary driver. Because capacity is limited and they're worried about how they're going to pay the bills, right? So it's certainly that's anecdotal, but that's my impression.
Yeah, I wonder if, it's a natural, we're in it. We're not looking back at this thinking, right, well, what can we learn from it? We're still very much in this. And I think the best that we can do is support our customers as they go through this, and we go through this together, but also try to extrapolate as much learning from this as we go through it, so we can inform when everyone comes up for air and goes, okay, fine, well, how can we now take what we've learned, the bow wave of that, and become stronger and more efficient and become more effective, make sure we don't lose those learnings. I guess that's the best thing that we can do as providers and consultants and generally advisors to the sector.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that there's going to be an opportunity for that because we have these people in a conversation now. And we're also going to see changes in the business models because there's just a whole bunch more organizations using more and different tools than there was 6-8 months ago. That's going to change what it looks like on all these platforms, in all these payment processors, right? It's not going to look the same as it did. We see a shift in the donation behavior, and we're going to be seeing a similar kind of shift just within this business. Probably more in the U.S. than a lot of other places. The U.S. giving is still very largely by mail. And that finally got substantially disrupted. When I was in Sweden and I talked about the fact that the most money in the U.S. in donations comes in via paper check, the audience laughed, right? Like it was just a bizarre thought to them that was still a primary component of giving in the U.S. We've just had like a major shakeup of that, and nobody's business is going to look the same after 2020. And you're right, we're in the middle of it, so I don't think we have a full understanding of what that's going to look like, including just how many small organizations with even a lesser capacity are going to have to be navigating this.
I know you may have just answered this slightly with the answer being, I don't know, but I have to ask with, so much rapid change in the past 6 months and also so much change in the past decade or two in terms of solutions available, adoption, like where do you see things going from here? If you had to make a prediction about major changes in the next 5 years and how we're managing data and how security is embedded in nonprofit operations, where would you predict things go? Sorry, that's the impossible question.
Predictions are so tough right now. To Andrew's point, we're right in the middle of shifts, all kinds of shifts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what is clear is that we will. This is not a shift to away from in-person events and collecting cash. It's not a shift to digital that is going to shift back substantially after things, when we're back to whatever new normal looks like, new abnormal. I think we're not going to see a reversion, right? We're going to see a sector that is more digital first than ever before, and that is going to be sustained and continue to grow, maybe even at a higher rate than it was growing prior to 2020. And I think the biggest change there will be with the small to mid-sized organizations who are more behind the curve. I mean, beyond that, it's hard for me to know what the kind of downstream effects of that are within the vendor community that supports those organizations and the payments industry that supports them. Andrew might have a better sense of what that will mean for that business, but I think a lot of it just remains to be seen.
I feel like there's like a whole bunch of caveats that I need to put before anything I say with a prediction. It's like results may vary depending on. So I think what's fascinating here is that we still honestly, I believe, if we're honest with ourselves as organizations, we still think of online and offline.
No.
And I don't think that that's how we operate. I don't think that's how the world works anymore, but still we believe that. And I think structurally, I still think that, organizationally, some organizations are still built like that. There's direct marketing, and then there's, digital, and then and so I almost feel like 2020 is going to become one of the gates, if you think about it, going back, if you think about it at the very beginning, those seminal online fundraising events, if you think about Katrina, if you think about tsunami, if you think about, those kind of events, all of those ones throughout I think you're going to look at COVID in 2020 and say, well, these are all of the progression with which we moved online and organizations moved online. And I think that what's going to end up happening is that it is going to further kind of compress everything and make organization, it's going to facilitate the quicker move to one view of a donor and one view of how to interact and how to match that donor's requests and requirements and behavior, which is changing on a regular, frequent basis. So I think what's going to end up happening is that this is just going to be an evolution of the same. And it's just going to be another one of those, which is it's going to get us further down the line of realizing that there is no distinction anymore between online and offline. But I think what it's going to also happen is going to, and I'm hopeful of this, that it's going to increase the conversation about data security, because it's all online, everything's in the cloud, everything is out there. And people are going to there are going to be more instances of breaches. There are going to be more instances of these things happening, not for want of any other of these organizations doing their level best, but that's just the nature of these things. And I think that when you talk about, it's our responsibility to educate and to talk about these things and to let organizations know what they should be doing in order to protect themselves so they are not one of those stories. And I think that's we're going to see more. And we have a very big mandate as a company, as IADS, is we see this as our top 3 priorities, which is really shouting as loud as we can about the importance of peace. It's a very, very dry subject, and we know it's not exciting, and we know it's not sexy to talk about, but it's fundamentally important for organizations to realize. And it's the flag that we have to carry because we are at the forefront of it as a payment provider. And so I think that's a long answer, Mitch, to your question, but I hope it somewhat answers it without all the necessary caveats.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Andrew, because we've been saying for a couple of years now that organizations need to get rid of this idea that donors are either offline or online, and that's not how donors think of themselves. And it's not a useful segmentation. The fact that there is a dichotomy there is at least in part, if not largely, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the organizations are choosing to engage their donors in that way because they think that's the way the donors want to be engaged. The most valuable donors do lots of things. They give directly online on a website, and they write a check, and they're responding in lots of different ways. And I agree. I think that our current challenges and crises of 2020 are going to drive some new best practice in lots of different ways, including that. And that organizations will start to realize, giving directly online to an organization's website is exactly as popular behavior as writing a check to an organization in the US. It doesn't bring in as much of the total dollars, but I think that just tells you that it's a red herring, this idea that the donors are one thing or another. And I agree. I think we're going to see a lot of new ways that organizations start to engage because they were forced to, that are going to accelerate adoption of best practice.
Yeah, and I think donor behavior is also changing because irrespective of what we see in the nonprofit sector, if you have a credit card in your, and I use credit cards as an example, if you have a credit card in your wallet, we are now becoming less likely to accept things that put us at risk as a credit card holder. We are less likely to want to give. As little as yesterday or the day before, I was asked to write my credit card down on a piece of paper and send it to somebody to pay for something. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that because you shouldn't do that. And so I think more and more now that vendor is less likely to ask for that again, and they're less likely to accept it. And I think that is also a change as we as consumers, if you like, as whether of our data, we're becoming more conscious of our data. That is not only our financial data, but also our personal data. All of the big things that we're hearing against social media, it's all about the data. So I think we're becoming more intelligent as consumers, and we're becoming more accepting or not accepting of what we're prepared to give and to have shared. And so I think we as a sector, as a nonprofit sector, have a responsibility again to take that very seriously. And the organizations that are going to be successful are the ones that do that because the donors have choices. They have choices about where they give, and they're going to give to organizations that respect that data and their fiscal security.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion around leveraging technology to better manage this donor stewardship, right? And not categorizing them in those more arcane ways. But I think the important takeaway here is that security is part and parcel of that, not only for your own organization, but that's how you best serve the donor. And that's what they're looking for and they're more conscious of.
Yeah, and I think it is about, I'm coming back to the awareness piece, which is it's about awareness. It's also many organizations that we work with don't even understand right now with their current system who owns the risk, the financial risk. Some of them believe that actually that's with their provider, or it's with their payment provider, or we don't worry about that because it's not really. And it's just a lack of awareness of the documentation that they've signed to understand, well, where does that awareness sit? So I think the evolution of all of this is, if anything else, people are going to be asking questions, and they're going to be saying, right, well, what's the right thing to do for my donor? And what's the right thing to do for my organization? By signing this and committing to this particular organization, what am I signing my organization up for? What am I signing my donor up for? Because it's all the same thing. That's what's happening when you're making these decisions. It is directly impacting not only the organization, but those that are supporting your organization.
That's another thing, going back to your question, Mitch, about what to ask vendors, providers. One of the things I would look at if I were choosing a vendor would be, is the security and compliance paperwork that I'm agreeing to about security, or is it about liability? And there's going to be some of both, right? But to varying degrees, different vendors will kind of transfer the liability, and that's something I would want to have a real good understanding of, which is, am I being asked to sign off on a bunch of things because my vendor knows full well I'm not going to be compliant on all of those things, and therefore the vendor's liability is reduced? Those are the kinds of things I would be taking a real close look at. Yeah. It needs to be a partnership.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I think people are starting to understand, that it's not a handoff. It's not, we like to live in a binary world. It's either this is it now, it's on, it's off, it's this, it's that. But it's not like that. It is a chain of responsibility, and everyone is responsible. And so partnership is an important word that is so often overused, but the truth is that it is. Everyone is responsible. Every party is responsible. We have a responsibility to make sure that the tools that we deliver reduce the risk of somebody being able to use a charity's website to test credit cards, or to make sure that the donor is who they say is, to the extent that we can do that. The charity's responsibility in that is to make sure that they provide us with the right information at the right time so we can do our job accordingly. And then the technology provider, whether that's a CRM or a peer-to-peer provider, bringing those parties together is to make sure that that is holistic and we're all working together, and that the risk is not creating exposure to either the intent of us as a payment processor or the customer, the merchant. So yeah, it definitely is, as you say, it requires all parties to work very closely together and not hand off responsibility, because then that's just assurance. That's not compliance.
And I think you get at partnership and the ability to work in partnership through some of that questioning. So like, even if people are you expect to get some similar answers, it's kind of the way in which people assure you and explain their own processes and how they want to work with you that is more important than just knowing whether they're compliant on a specific measure here or there. It's
not a destination. It literally is a journey. You can't say I'm compliant, next subject, let's move on. You can't. You have to constantly, and that's, I think, also the struggle, because it's like, wow, my goodness, that's like heavy lifting. That sounds like hard work. Well, yeah, that's what comes with this great, wonderful new world of e-commerce and online fundraising, and taking advantage of being able to reach more donors and have a deeper engagement with them. That's part of that. That's part of that journey.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today. And I mean, I know you said you thought this was an exciting topic, Andrew, but I found it super interesting. So yeah, you've done a good job of making it more interesting.
I mean, I love it, but I don't get invited to many parties. So.
Awesome. Well, take care, and thank you again for the time, and we'll be chatting soon. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion. Be sure to join Empower Us for more resources and one-on-one help in finding the tech solutions you need. If you have any feedback or suggestions, you can email us at info@empowerus.org. Thank you.